این بانگ آزادی کز خاوران خیزد، فریاد انسان هاست کز نای جان خیزد، اعلام توفان هاست کز هر کران خیزد، آتش فشان قهر ملت های در بند است، حبل المتین توده های آرزومند است. دشمن بداند ما موج خروشانیم، زائیده بحریم فرزند توفانیم، در سنگر اسلام گذشته از جانیم، بازو به بازو صف به صف ما آهنین چنگیم، سنگر به سنگر جان به کف آماده جنگیم. تخت شهنشاهان شد سرنگون از ما، بخت تبهکاران شد واژگون از ما، دامان آزادی شد لالگون از ما، ما حافظ آزادی و اسلام و قرآنیم، ما در پی آسایش و معراج انسانیم. ما در ره اسلام پیمان خون بستیم، زنجیر استعمار مردان بگسستیم، از دام اهریمن با یاد حق رستیم، ما نغمه الله اکبر بر زبان داریم، ما چون خمینی رهبری روشن روان داریم. الله اکبر خمینی رهبر، الله اکبر خمینی رهبر، الله اکبر خمینی رهبر.
Hello everybody and welcome, and we bring in our comrade and friend Kit Clarenberg is with us again. Kit, I hope you enjoyed the highlight reel of True Promise Free, revealing, of course, much greater damage than long-term US asset Benjamin Netanyahu is prepared to admit to, and revealing the end game possibly for the Zionist entity and the Anglo-American presence in West Asia. So what better time to come to you live to unpack this and many more mysteries. Kit, how are you doing today?
I'm very well. Dying slightly in the future Yugoslavian heat, but I mean this is a standard, summer thing. So I'm getting kind of used to it now. But I mean that aside, no, I did greatly enjoy the opening credits. It's a shame it wasn't set to celebrate "Good Times Come On" by Kool and the Gang. But the soundtrack was suitable, I think. So yes, we come at you as events continue to. Oh, how would I phrase this? As the events napkin unswivels inexorably, ushering in changes and confusion and uncertainty and upheaval and tension. We're here to at least have a go at unpacking it all for you. So thanks so much. It's great to see so many people have joined. Yes, excellent, very excellent to see. Yes, if you've not already, for whatever crazy reason, signed up to our Substack or our YouTube channel or our Twitter to ensure that you get regular updates on our content. We're not just going to be doing weekly broadcasts. We do have specials in the pipeline, like our excellent Yugoslavia special. You should watch if you haven't already done so. We're hoping to get some guests on at different stages, so stay tuned.
Yes, indeed. And be sure to like and share this stream if you have not done so already. The title of today's episode, of course, is "The Centre Cannot Hold," which is a reference to the very famous W.B. Yeats poem. And the centre now is disintegrating all around us, as can be seen from some of the stories we've got lined up for you today. Hello to everybody in the chat thus far. So hello to Jerry, Daniel, Thomas Wolf, Bertram, Nick from rural Thailand. It's a global audience today. Somebody called The Lemon, Jasmine Wolf, Rupert Fellows, and yes, we've also got T.G. Wilson and Miguel Carvalho with us. Good to have you all with us. Be sure.
And the mighty Jerry Jacobs has joined us as well, which is excellent news.
Yes, comrade of mine from the CPGBML. So it's a Marxist-Leninist afternoon, as it always is here. So we turn first, I think, to the various admissions made by American officials about just how useless and ineffective their strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities were, and just how much of a pantomime missiles it was, and also that, and the news is coming out even from Western sources now, that this was a US instigated ceasefire to basically stop Israel sliding further down the tubes. So we've got here an admission carried, it was in the Wall Street Journal, but it was also carried in like the New York Times and the Washington Post, regarding the ineffective nature of the strikes on Fordow and other nuclear facilities in Iran, and that this was essentially meaningless. In the words of Shakespeare's Macbeth, all sound and fury and signifying nothing, which could be an allegory for the entire Trump presidency, really. But Trump, of course, reacted furiously, accusing the fake news media of insulting the glorious B-2 pilots, even though we don't even really know if it was B-2 bombers who did this. The best estimates say that it actually was Tomahawk missiles fired from submarines. We don't know as yet for sure, but that seems more likely. But Kit, how again, we are weary of taking so many victory laps, but I think that this is worthy of another one, given that you and I discussed that the only strike available to the US was going to be a purely symbolic one, and here it is. Even the Wall Street Journal is confirming it now.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I find truly amazing, and we discussed this in advance, such as our amazing power of foresight on our regular program last week, and we discussed it in the post-mortem on the 12-day war. But once the dust had settled and the scale of Israel's defeat had become very clear, I saw, as we were about to go live, that actually John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director and director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, have suddenly issued statements saying that, in fact, new intelligence shows that Iran's nuclear facilities were, in fact, destroyed. I mean, pull the other one, right? I mean, we've had ever since the US's very flaccid strike, which it appears that they forewarned the Iranians about because they were worried about escalation, and they were just planning to conduct a token strike, which they could then subsequently falsely claim had been absolutely devastating when it wasn't. It is so abundantly clear, based on open source evidence, based on mainstream reporting, that the US strike on Iran was pathetic. Like, it didn't achieve anything. The Iranians, perhaps because of forewarning, they moved nuclear assets away from the target sites. They attempted to protect the sites as best they could, and it appears that yes, some Tomahawk missiles. There's zero evidence B-2 bombers, let alone bunker busters, were deployed. This is a heavily mobile phone filmed war. If there was any truth to this, some footage would have emerged. By now, it hasn't. The media has typically relied on graphic maps claiming that the damage was extensive, which kind of remember with Donald Rumsfeld's map of like Al Qaeda bases in Afghanistan, where they were all meant to have these like vast underground complexes resembling Thunderbirds. Like just complete and utter rubbish. And I think that what it does, there's another aspect to this too, which is not getting nearly enough attention, I think, is the fact that the cost of this from Israel's perspective, both in terms of the how much the difficult to replace at any pace or scale missiles and munitions they used in failing to trigger regime change or damage Iran in any meaningful way. On top of the enormous cost of that, Iran has devastated Tel Aviv, other urban centers in quote unquote Israel, and we don't even know the full extent of the damage to military sites because of Israeli military censorship. And my dear friend and colleague at the Grey Zone, Jeremy Lafredo, had a very, very disturbing brush with the Israeli legal system for documenting Iranian strikes on on Israel last year. So, journalists, quote unquote, know not to even raise questions about that. So, I have seen some estimations that the overall kind of direct and indirect losses that Israel has suffered, to say nothing of how much this cost the US, is in the tens of billions.
Well, this is what we've talked about before, which is the costs associated with this war weren't meant to be this high. We discussed this when in last week's episode and in the special edition just the other day, which is that this was meant to be a quick and easy regime change job. Pretty obviously, given that they had, why someone advised them that the son of the former Shah was the good guy to head this up and be the front man for it, I don't know. Points to a spectacularly out of touch mentality, given that he is despised even by other Iranian exiles. So, quite why he was the man they chose, I don't know. Other than the fact that Trump's like, he's a king. I like kings. We should put a king in charge, Well,
can I just interject as well that Rudy Giuliani of all people, that walking excrement, posted this absolutely vicious diatribe about the son of the Shah of Iran, of all people. When Rudy Giuliani thinks you're a wanker, that is low. That is extremely low. And I think that, I would urge viewers to check out our short post-mortem special broadcast on this, is the son of the Shah of Iran is surrounded by these completely insane ultra-nationalists who venerate Savak and believe that dissidents in Iran and leftists should be prisoned or jailed or killed. They are completely opposed to any form of free media. They are, they support mass domestic repression. Iranians, being smart, nice people, the second that someone like Pahlavi or any of his rabble gets behind an attempted regime change up or even just basic protests in Tehran, they run a mile. because they want absolutely nothing to do with him. And I think, as we discussed last week, the women's life freedom movement died overnight when the Shah's son started publicly backing them at the end of 2022. Like, it ceased to exist. Like, that's how much he is hated.
Well, and this is the problem that the US has, is that one of the problems is that they were always relying upon other forces to do the dirty work on the ground. I mean, again, like you and I have discussed extensively, why the US cannot directly intervene in Ukraine, and for all the reasons we've talked about before, and the fact that they do fear the Russian armed forces, and they're not going to do an invasion of Iran for similar reasons. Now, just to go back 20 plus years to the invasion of Iraq, that was their last big ground operation. And that came after a decade of sanctions and unrestricted CIA and other intelligence agencies operations inside Iraq. And I saw a reminder of this the other day. Before the war began, the US literally paid off huge numbers of Iraqi generals to stand their men down and not fight. So their initial invasion went so quickly and so smoothly because they literally starved the nation first, then paid off all the generals, and so they could have a free run basically to Baghdad. So they aren't going to get the same opportunities when it comes to Iran, which is, again, a much bigger country. And the US ruling class is terrified of gigantic combat losses because, and for good reason, because it would provoke the kind of domestic revolt they haven't seen in 50 plus years, and that their system might well crumble under it. So they're not going to make these moves, no matter how much Shah Pahlavi begs them to. What they are going to try and do is to get whatever followers he has, or the MEK, or like Balochi or Kurdish separatists, to do the dirty work on the ground. But it didn't materialize this time round after the first big hit. So they were left with, not many options, truth be told. So they, again, Wall Street Journal, a reliable barometer of reactionary ruling class opinion inside the United States, again, forced to admit that the war did damage to Iran, but again, the regime change operation completely and utterly failed. So to reiterate what was supposed to happen, the big strikes on the first day were meant to decapitate the IRGC and meant to destabilize the system. We don't know at this stage if they tried a direct strike on Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei early on. My guess, it is just speculation. My guess is that they tried it and it didn't work. And that's why Trump later said, "Oh, I vetoed it," But if they were going to do regime change, then just killing the senior commanders of the IRGC doesn't make sense. Given that Trump was openly talking about assassinating Khamenei, I think personally they tried it and it didn't come off. But now the Wall Street Journal has to admit that this hasn't worked. And in actual fact, most of the analysis coming from Iran now says that the population has consolidated behind the government at this stage, and is actually demanding that the Iranian government take more strong action to actually counter Israel and the United States. So this is a total utter failure, which again the US had to scuttle out of because its Zionist colonial state was getting damaged more in this short war than it had been in any of the wars after 1947. Kit, your analysis of this?
Yeah, well, I think there are three major kind of boomerangs here that I think that aren't getting enough scrutiny or attention, which is, on top of being a military disaster, there are three major upshots of this. Number one, moderates who were on board with negotiating with the West in Iran have been discredited. Okay, so Iran understands that they are dealing with deeply devious, unscrupulous, and quite frankly satanic, from their perspective, operators. There was a report, I believe, yesterday, that my friend Darren Mate noted, where it was acknowledged that Israel had been planning to conduct this strike for a long time. It was originally drawn up during the Biden administration, which had put to bed any suggestion that if Kamala was in, this wouldn't have happened. But not only that, they specifically picked their timing because Israeli intelligence indicated that there were gaps in Iran's missile, air defenses that were being rectified. So they wanted to strike before Iran was fully kind of impenetrable. Now, another upshot of this is that, I mean, Trump is talking about a new nuclear deal. The day before Israel carried out its criminal strike on Iran, Press TV, which is the Iranian state broadcaster, they published a ton of documents showing that the IAE is heavily compromised and infiltrated by Israel up to its highest levels. So you have it, the association chief Grossi is in direct contact with the Israelis and taking orders from them. Now, very, very obvious questions hang over whether the IAEA gave Israel detailed intelligence and location data in order to help their targeting. So the IAEA will never ever be allowed into Iran ever again under any circumstances. So it's difficult to see how any nuclear deal arises from this. But there's another aspect of this too, which is that you know, as I say, there are numerous Israeli cities in ruins as a result of this. This is not something that Israelis have ever experienced. It is having a hugely damaging psychological impact on the population. You know, a core component of their kind of national mythos is that they are undefeated in war. That effectively they get to go around smashing other countries if and when they want without any comebacks. Iran has shown that it can inflict far greater damage on Israel than Israel can inflict on Iran. And I mean, you know, I believe that we discussed this, but it does bear repeating. I saw a number of explainer guides in mainstream outlets on how is the Iron Dome not protecting Israel from Iranian missile strikes. Now, the Iron Dome has been a really potent propaganda tool, but whereby Israel has claimed ever since its rollout in 2011, well, the only reason that we're safe and we're not being attacked is because of the Iron Dome. And it was also used to explain why the Iron Dome was also used as a rationale for explaining why in Israel's quote unquote wars with Hamas, that Palestinian casualties were always massive and their own were tiny. Well, you know, the unspoken truth was that their quote unquote wars were one-sided gang beatings of a defenseless captive population in an open-air concentration camp. So, you know, the psychological impact of this is difficult to overstate, actually. And I think that, I mean, Netanyahu is already hated. There are mainstream outlets in Israel itself that are talking about civil war. You know, the state is on the verge of collapse as a result of doing this. And if they are stupid enough to try it again, well, you know, the Operation True Promise 4 could finish the job.
Well, yes, and this is something which is desperately being covered up by Trump and others, because they suddenly realized that if they didn't get regime change in Iran within 48 hours, then they were in a lot of trouble. Not just them, of course, but not just the Israelis, but also the Gulf tyrannies who host a lot of American military assets. In the end, there was a a sort of coordinated piece of theatre between Iran and the US, where the US uselessly struck the Iranian nuclear facilities, and then the Iranians fired the exact same number of missiles into an American base in Qatar, and which would have been largely evacuated. So this was an American exit strategy in actual fact. Now, the Washington Post made a interesting attempt to spin this as some amazing new Trump doctrine, which was, you can see this on the screen now, Trump's approach to military action, a hard punch and a fast exit. Well, the fast exit is certainly true. The hard punch was somewhat lacking, given that even like Western sources tell us that the Iranian nuclear program, as we've already seen, has barely been damaged, and also that according to US/British/Israeli stooge Rafael Grossi of the IAEA, that the progress towards a nuclear weapon has not been disrupted if Iran chose to go in that direction. So this is like the Washington Post trying to cover up basically a disaster, and the fact that the emperor is completely naked now, and they can't invade anywhere. They can't really sustain a war against Iran, never mind Russia or China. So really, this is just a case of like another stage on the downward spiral of US imperialism. And of course, when US imperialism is finally finished, that means so is Britain, and that means also so is Europe. For all Friedrich Merz's strange pronouncements about German remilitarization, which we'll get to later. This is fig leaf for the emperor time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's like, yeah, I mean, as we say, there has been, after these initial claims of, oh well, we completely obliterated their nuclear facilities, and it's all over. Suddenly, pretty much immediately, we had a trickle into the media of oh, actually, it wasn't that damaging at all. Yes, there are endless efforts to try and polish this turd, without any real serious analysis of what a failure and defeat this is. And I think that as I mentioned, Trump is still talking about trying to broker deals with the Iranians and etc. If that does come to pass, and I don't see any reason why Iran would have any interest or desire to negotiate with the Americans about literally anything at this point, the US is not going to be able to negotiate from any position of strength whatsoever. The ever on point armchair warlord, he did a lengthy write-up of the absolute embarrassment of the Israeli-US 12-day war on Iran, where he noted that, if the US strike is the best that the US can do, then we're in real trouble. Like the US military is in even shoddier state than we thought. And I think that yes, this subsequent kind of propaganda war or propaganda blitz, desperately trying to dress up this failure, it's trying to compensate and distract and misdirect people from the fact that this is yet another. I mean, Trump, the supposed anti-war president, he came into office making all sorts of bold pronouncements about maximum pressure on Iran, and he, of course, launched a second war on Ansarallah in Yemen, which the New York Times has since reported was initially intended to be a lengthy campaign ending in all-out invasion of Yemen using local proxies, and that was, after 30 days of pounding Yemen relentlessly from the air. The US hadn't even acquired air supremacy. They were under constant fire from Ansarallah, and this is, a quote unquote unsophisticated resistance group. A conflict with Iran would be absolute suicide, and the US knows it.
Well, let's just revisit for a moment, like some great US/British triumphs over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. So what have we had? We've had the campaign, the first Gulf War, which was basically a farce, considering that the Ba'athist government in Baghdad really didn't want to fight the US anyway. And as US officers who were there at the time confirm, obligingly let the US and its coalition partners land all their forces in Saudi without firing a shot at them. So they got to assemble this vast army, then use it with barely any opposition, having bombed Iraq relentlessly for a couple of months beforehand. And then the Iraqis turned around and left, and the Americans bombed them on the highway of death, leaving Kuwait. So again, barely any opposition there. Well, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, which were again fought with local proxies, which the CIA, MI6, and the Germans had fostered for many, many years. The Kosovo War, which was won, as you can see in our incredible special on the subject, was won ultimately by a betrayal carried out by Yeltsin and the Kremlin clique at the time. Again, we've already mentioned the Iraq War of 2003, won by essentially bribing Iraqi generals. And what else has happened since then? Any triumphs that they've had, like Libya and Syria, have been won by mercenary forces and air power and sanctions. So what's become obvious is that this amazing army that they keep going on and on about, which can barely march in a straight line, in actual fact, can't fight, can't win anything. They win via exploiting internal contradictions in other countries, getting people to betray each other, moving around a lot of money, special operations stuff, terrorism actions, again, all the stuff that the British specialize in actual fact. So when called upon to actually go and do the nasty work themselves, US presidents and generals run a mile from this. And this yet again confirms it. And it's going to be seen by everybody who is an opponent of US and British imperialism across the world as yet another sign that the empire is dead, and it's time to move against it. But I will just conclude my comment on this section by saying that the US and Israel and Britain will inevitably have another go at Iran sometime soon, which is why I think the Iranian defense minister was in Beijing yesterday meeting with his Chinese and Russian equivalents. So basically, following the meeting between Foreign Minister Aragchi and Putin, and the conclusion of this war, it looks like the Chinese and the Russians called the Iranians into a meeting and said, well, we will probably, this is my guess, we will assist you in rebuilding your defenses, basically, because neither China nor Russia can afford Iran to fall to US aggression. So they need to essentially replace what was lost to the US-Israeli attacks. But Kit, what's your response to that, and any final word on the naked emperors flailing in Persia?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think it's important to note that. Yes, excuse me. I've got to stop. I've actually stopped smoking on the streams because people have complained. And that this is the result. I hope you're happy. But essentially,
I never listen to customer complaints. That's what I say.
Well, no, we do value our audience. So, but anyway, the point, I think that the point is, and at the risk of repeating ourselves, is that, like, I just think that the US and Israel obviously remain extremely dangerous, and Israel in particular, they are backed into a corner, and they subscribe to something called the Samson option, under which they reserve the right to carry out preemptive nuclear strikes, not only on regional adversaries but also their Western allies into the bargain. And there was a Dutch-born, quote-unquote, Israeli historian Martin van Creveld, who once boasted, we have the capability to take the world down with us, and that will happen before Israel falls, I can assure you. But the fact is that, I just think that we have seen the extent of the closelessness. And what's more is that this extends not only to the US and its Zionist proxy, but also all of its European vassals as well. I mean, this feeds in quite neatly into our next section, but it's just like as we have discussed again on previous shows, and it does bear repeating, is the fact that the US's kind of war fighting model for a very long time has effectively been based on creating a groaning, exorbitantly priced military machine, which is explicitly suited to one-sided gang beatings of countries that can't fight back. Iran has demonstrated it can fight back if it wishes, if it is provoked, to a far greater extent than Israel and the US can. So there's that aspect of it. But yes, as you mentioned as well, this has just pushed Iran further into the economic and military fold of China and Russia. While there has been since February 2022 deepening relations between Iran and Russia and security cooperation, they still don't have a formal agreement on military matters, etc. I think that's going to change now. And I think that we may have highlighted it in our last episode, but Dmitry Medvedev said, well, a very obvious upshot of this is that of this attack on Iran is that Iran, which wasn't seeking nuclear weapons, is now going to get them. And there are a number of countries, including North Korea and potentially Pakistan, who would be more than willing to assist them. So again, all round, this is a failure of absolutely spectacular proportions. It's only not perceived as one because of this vast propaganda matrix, relentlessly pushing the point home that, actually this was successful, despite loath as I am to quote that well-known British intelligence asset George Orwell. In 1984, he said, the party made you deny the reality of your eyes and ears. I think we've kind of reached that point.
Yes, well, I've said for a while now that 1984 wasn't about the Soviet Union or socialism in reality, whether Orwell knew it or not. It was actually about Britain and the United States and the imperialist countries, because that's the much more appropriate comparison, given that the twists and turns in narrative management in the West are much more blatant, obvious, and crude than anything that was produced by the Soviet system. So, talking of narrative management and talking of trying to paper over cracks and talking of strange and embarrassing incidents in foreign countries, we come, of course, to the NATO summit, which is a series of embarrassments wrapped up in a bizarre incident between Mark Rutte and Donald Trump. But first of all, let's go for the comedy. And here we have Trump and Rutte in a very strange incident in a press conference. Let's see this.
They fight like two kids in a schoolyard. They fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have
get
to use
stuff.
strong language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
Right, I hope you all caught
Daddy.
that. The Rutte, Secretary General of NATO and former Dutch Prime Minister, is responding to Trump's strange analogy about Iran and Israel being like two kids fighting. Says, Daddy has to use strong language, which is very strange, to say the least, and follows on from this equally weird and groveling text that he sent to Trump, which Trump dutifully published on Truth Social, thus making Rutte look like an utter walking penis. We now publish this for you, which is, I will read it out for the benefit of those listening on the audio version of this. Dear Mr. President, dear Donald, for the purposes of not offending our Dutch listeners, I won't do the accent. Congratulations and thank you for your decisive action in Iran that was truly extraordinary and something no one else dared to do. It makes us all safer. Again, this is stuff that is completely divorced from reality. Continues, you are flying into another big success in The Hague this evening. It was not easy, but we've got them all signed onto 5%. Donald, you have driven us to a really, really important moment for America and Europe and the world. You will achieve something no capitalized American president in decades could get done. Europe is going to pay in a quote unquote big way, as they should, and it will be your win. Safe travels and see you at His Majesty's dinner. Now, I want you to note, that yes, vomit inducing, but also note that Rutte or whoever writes this stuff for him is consciously mimicking Trump's own style in the language there, where she's like bizarre capitalizations, going to win in a big way. You are flying into a big success. I mean, it's transparent groveling, of course, but when it comes down to it, it is also ass-kissing manipulation, which is a skill that the British ruling class are particularly adept at, and the Dutch being also one of the oldest capitalist powers and one of the oldest imperialist powers have also perfected this. But let's get to the official communique or the official statement of the heads of government coming from the NATO summit. Because
sorry to interrupt, but can I just say as well that like Mark Rutte, what's really interesting, what's actually what makes his sucking up to Trump even more nauseating and pathetic is he actually became Mark Rutte became something of a hero to mainstream liberals and anti-Trumpers in July 2018, when he had a sit-down meeting with Donald Trump about a US-EU trade deal. And Trump, in his usual rambling style, said, well, it will be a really good thing if we get a trade deal, but it will also be a good thing if we don't get a trade deal. And Mark Rutte interjected and said, no, it won't be a good thing if we don't get an EU-US trade deal. And he became a hero of the anti-Trump quote unquote resistance. So it's quite interesting the difference 7 years makes, isn't it? Like
the status of Europe and the EU has been severely damaged. The prestige of it has been damaged. It's a lot weaker now, and also they're given that the US is the one doing the heavy lifting in the Ukraine war, and we'll get to this in just a moment. They know damn well that the Europeans can't do it without the US, and so this is all desperate groveling to keep the US engaged in Europe. And now they're very worried that the visible slide in US power means that the US is going to prioritize elsewhere, and it will leave them literally holding the Ukrainian baby in this particular scenario. So if we go to the statement from this summit, which is a nothing statement, by the way, just like most of the pronouncements from Keir Starmer signify absolutely nothing. So This is a very short statement, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through it, and we'll pause and critique when needed. So this is the statement. But for some reason they had like a one-day summit this time, presumably because that's all Trump wanted to attend. Statement reads as follows: "We, the heads of state and government of the North Atlantic Alliance, have gathered in The Hague to reaffirm our commitment to NATO, the strongest alliance in history, and to the transatlantic bond. We reaffirm our ironclad commitment." They love the term ironclad. "Commitment to collective defense as enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. That's an attack on one is an attack on all. We remain united and steadfast in our resolve to protect our 1 billion citizens, defend the alliance, and safeguard our freedom and democracy." By the way, Trump has been all over the map on Article 5. And again, like, what that reveals, I think, and Kit, what I'll ask your opinion on this. Trump said, when asked about Article 5, I think it was on the plane over, said basically, "Well, I don't know about that." Because again, this is the reason they don't like Trump, the American liberals, that is, or the Democratic faction of the American liberals, is because he says openly what everybody knows privately. And everybody knows privately that the US isn't going to take a nuclear bullet for Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, or maybe even Poland itself. Article 5 only works if it's never tested, because if it's tested, then what will be revealed is you've got 20 odd countries in Europe that can't fight for shit and can't do anything and can't produce war material and are reliant on the US, which is also a Potemkin power now when it comes to actually fighting. But Kit, your take on the Article 5 stuff and other related issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I was trying to drive at in my comment on how America's war machine works, is that they're completely impotent. Not can't even call it strategy. They're entirely impotent military structure, which is based on spending lots of money on stuff that doesn't really work and can't win wars. Has been adopted wholesale by Europe. And there was an astonishing Politico article in April. I'm not sure if we delved into it. I think we may well have done on a prior edition. But it was titled "The US Cavalry Isn't Coming." And it talked about how all of Europe's infrastructure, defense infrastructure, has been built on the assumption that the Americans will come to the rescue. Right now, it must be stressed that throughout the 1990s, when there was a push by European powers, particularly France and Germany, to create an independent military structure in Europe, the US was dead set against this. They pretty much made clear that they wanted NATO to remain because it meant to not be compromised by the emergence of an independent European army, because NATO was how the US remained the dominant power in Europe, despite not being a European country. And numerous US officials effectively acknowledged that NATO was a means of granting US privileged access to European markets and preventing the emergence of economic competitors. And it's like, yeah, that Politico report, but effectively signed off, saying that, well, there is a risk that Europe has been investing in and planning for a war based on the assumption of US support that may never materialize. It was never going to. It was never, ever going to. That was never the point of NATO. It was never about collective defense or even cooperation or collaboration in the military sphere. It was about ensuring that countries wedged under NATO's heel were dependable vassals, that military operations could be outsourced to them, that they would do the fighting and dying rather than the US, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. That was the precise strategy, was to get the kind of cheap soldiers to use as cannon fodder if in the event a war did come. I mean, and I think that someone in our comment section, I know, this conference, it didn't even last a day; it lasted 2 hours. And in the lead up, it was reported that Zelensky's presence at the summit had been diplomatically demoted to ensure that he wouldn't cross paths with Trump. Talk about brotherhood and unity, eh? So yeah, I mean, it's just like, as is so often the case with this stuff, it's a bunch of people going over very well-worn and extremely kind of cringe-inducing cliches, saying things that they know that they don't actually believe. But they know that they have to say for the purposes of ensuring the emperor is kept happy. And I think that as we'll get into, like, all of the quote unquote new commitments that have emerged from this conference are so utterly pathetic and empty. And I think it says something that, yes, that this grand Hague Summit declaration runs to about 500 words and covers just 5 points.
Yes. Well, time to get into the aforementioned commitments, because this is the fun stuff. So point 2 reads as follows, this is by fun, I mean about as fun as reading a Jeffrey Archer novel, only without the amazing plot twists. So point 2. United in the face of profound security threats and challenges, in particular the long-term threat posed by Russia to Euro-Atlantic security, the persistent threat of terrorism, of which, by the way, more later, allies commit to invest 5% of GDP annually on core defense requirements, as well as defense and security-related spending by 2035, and ensure our individual and collective obligations in accordance with Article 3 of the Washington Treaty. Our investments will ensure we have the forces, capabilities, resources, infrastructure, warfighting readiness, and resilience needed to deter and defend in line with our 3 core tasks of deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. Point 3, because this is all related, I'll just continue reading. Allies agree that this 5% commitment will comprise 2 essential categories of defense investment. Allies will allocate at least 3.5% of GDP annually based on the agreed definition of NATO defense expenditure by 2035 to resource core defense requirements and to meet the NATO capability targets. Allies agree to submit annual plans showing a credible incremental path to reach this goal, and allies will account for up to 1.5% of GDP annually to inter alia protect our critical infrastructure, defend our networks, ensure our civil preparedness and resilience, unleash innovation, and strengthen our defense industrial base. Trajectory and balance of spending under this plan will be reviewed in 2029 in light of the strategic environment and updated capability targets. Allies reaffirm their enduring sovereign commitments to provide support to Ukraine, whose security contributes to ours, and to this end will include direct contributions towards Ukraine's defense and its defense industry when calculating allies' defense spending. And I'll just read these last 2 bits. We reaffirm our shared commitment to rapidly expand transatlantic defense industrial cooperation and to harness emerging technology and the spirit of innovation to advance our collective security. We'll work to eliminate defense trade barriers among allies and will leverage our partnerships to promote defense industrial cooperation. Final point. We express our appreciation for the generous hospitality extended to us by the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We look forward to our next meeting in Turkey in 2026, followed by a meeting in Albania. So, key things here, I would say, are this 5% by 2035 is possibly the most meaningless thing I've ever seen in my life, given that by 2035, there is every chance that the British and Western European, never mind the Eastern European economies, will have disappeared in a puff of smoke. given that GDP is stagnant or going backwards in terms of growth in most of these countries, and given that all the plans that Keir Starmer has for expanding the defence industrial base basically amount to building more submarines, buying some utterly useless F-35s from the United States, and sticking some nuclear missiles on them, and that's it. As we were talking about, you and I, earlier this week, like the Royal Navy admits it's running out of sailors. Its ships are widely regarded, even by critics from within Britain, as garbage. Like the US, as Trump admitted, can't build icebreakers, so is buying some off Finland, which haven't been built yet, of course. What happens, and I'll just conclude my thoughts on this point. What happens when you reach crisis point is that all of the structural weaknesses and contradictions in a system get brought out. And as Kit was saying, NATO was never about defending against the Soviet Union, because there was never a Soviet plan to invade Western Europe. What it was about was making sure that Europe was kept under the control of the United States, that capitalism was preserved in Europe, admittedly under US tutelage, and that the US and the British had the right to operate unrestricted intelligence maneuvers and counterinsurgency against any and all communist groups and working class organizations across Western Europe and Southern Europe as well, and to fund fascist organizations, be in league with organized crime, do all the fun stuff that we now know as Operation Gladio. That's the real purpose of NATO. It wasn't about fighting the Soviet Union at all. That was theatrics. Just as this isn't about fighting Russia, not really. All of the internal defense, all of the defense spending, and all the other stuff that they're talking about, the building up of the armies. These armies are not going to be used to fight the Russians, because we can't fight the Russians. That task will be outsourced to somebody else. What they'll be used for, I think, is internal domestic repression, which is, looming ever larger as time goes on. But Kit, your response to this incredible, bold, ironclad commitments from the NATO powers to do basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this fits very neatly into something that we have discussed many, many times, and it also reflects a tendency, and there are so many sources that all push in the same direction, which is that there are major structural issues within every European military. Recruitment is a massive issue. The war readiness of societies, let alone armies, is basically non-existent. They don't have the ammunition or the weaponry or the armor or the vehicles or the capacity to build them at any pace or scale. Most European countries have disarmed themselves by giving all their tanks or all their fighter jets to Ukraine so they can be destroyed by Russian artillery. For I would say probably about a year and a half, there's been a steady flow of statements by and official reports published by NATO members, which highlight all of these issues that I've just noted and that we have spoken about in enormous detail. And the answer is always, let's spend more money. As if this is going to achieve anything, as if suddenly pumping billions more into defense is going to automatically translate into more soldiers. It's going to automatically be converted into ammunition industry. It's not going to, it's not going to happen. There are so many examples of this. There was a RAND report last summer which found that the US military was in very dire straits, that the US had no defense industrial base to speak of, and there were very serious problems around manufacturing war fighting material, and then it concluded, well, we just need to spend more money. And there was a House of Lords report published at the same time, which concluded that, oh well, Britain is in no way equipped at all to fight a war such as that occurring in Ukraine, and they consulted numerous quote unquote defence experts and military people for this report, and they all just concluded, well, we just need to spend more money. Right, so it's just like it's yes, as you say, completely meaningless. As a pledge, and by 2035, I mean, will NATO exist? Will the EU exist? It is very much an open question, and I think that another point to make here as well is that we have heard all of these bold pronouncements from people like Friedrich Merz. And when I say bold pronouncements, I mean often he is engaging in incendiary rhetoric. There was a fantastic article by the independent journalist Thomas Farsi. We're hoping to get him on the show sometime, that he wrote for Unheard. You can find it on his personal Substack as well, where he just he goes into enormous detail about all these like completely insane pledges and threats and rhetoric in which Merz is engaging. But as we've discussed previously on the show, the German military is a joke. People enlisted in the German military with the expectation they will never be deployed or have to do anything, and it's an alternative to being unemployed or a stepping stone to getting into university. Overwhelmingly, over half of Germany's military is comprised of officer class people who won't do any of the fighting. People don't want to sign up to fight and die. They want to sign up and if necessary, oversee others dying. There's also the wider issue that Germans hate this. Like the German public themselves are not on board with this. They think that it is in stark contrast to their alleged, although largely mythical, kind of post World War II pacifist position, and it's going to take a lot more than printing a few euros to achieve any of Merz's bold pledges and proclamations. But in the meantime, he is green-lighting Ukrainian strikes deep in Russian territory and doing all sorts of things which are pissing off the Kremlin to the point of Moscow considering whether to designate Berlin a formal belligerent. If that does come, it's going to be a bloodbath.
Well, yes, this is the state that they've got themselves into now. Now, as we have talked about many times, the US spending an awful lot of money on so-called defense over the last 30 years. Trump's talking about $1 trillion defense budget. But the question is, where does it all go? Now, I think it would be interesting to take a look at some of the studies done on like how much money is missing from the Pentagon and how much money's just disappeared into a black hole. There are some good books on that, and it would be worth perhaps us doing a special on that in the future, because it reveals an awful lot about this defense spending, which is that so much of it just disappears into the pockets of contractors and doesn't produce anything. The British Ministry of Defence were forced to admit in their own studies of the Trident renewal program and the building of the new nuclear submarines that, because they're dealing with monopolies in the form of companies like Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, etc., they can charge what they want and be completely unaccountable for the cash. So imagine that, but on a much bigger scale. And you've got the US military-industrial complex, which makes dollars disappear quicker than like a magician hiding a rabbit. It is remarkable for its capacity to leak money and produce nothing. So they've been spending more and more and more over the course of the last 30 years and actually producing less, far less than they used to do like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even the 80s. Because what you've got now is a series of gigantic monopolies, including companies like Boeing, whose planes routinely fall out of the sky, who like again absorb cash and pump out failure or nothing at all. So like you've got the F-35, which costs like a gigantic amount of money, which is notoriously unreliable, very difficult to maintain, and the US is trying to force everybody to buy it anyway. They are rendering their own air forces useless against like the much more reliable Chinese and Russian produced equivalents, which are again, because like the Russian equivalent is rooted in much more reliable Soviet tech, which is where their developments, their technological roots start. It's far more reliable, far more dependable, and easier to maintain than anything in the European arsenal. And then the US is now insisting everybody's got to buy F-35s. Well, great, go ahead, render your Air Force an expensive joke, which is what they're doing. So this illusion that just spending money or announcing big amounts of cash going to something or another means anything is it's nonsense. And it again shows just like they clearly either one of two things is happening. Either they know that the Russians aren't going to invade Poland or wherever, maybe the Baltics, but nobody will care about that. They know very well that they're not going to invade Eastern or Western Europe, and this is all bullshit designed to cover up the colossal failure in Ukraine, which is still ongoing and is going to end, though quite soon, with the disastrous defeat of the NATO side, and papering over the cracks in their alliance by making these gigantic announcements at a summit that they couldn't wait to get out of, by the way. 2 hours for a summit meeting. That's not a summit meeting, that's a fucking Zoom call, basically. What I mean, they wouldn't even when I was working in like the public sector, they would deny you travel funds to go to a 2-hour meeting. It's like this is just these guys going on holiday, presumably frequenting the Amsterdam brothel scene or whatever the fuck they wanted to do. But this is insane.
I mean, I was going to say as well that this is. I would love to call attention, and I would urge our viewers and listeners, like, check out this piece by Craig Murray. It is an astonishing. It's his most recent article for his website. Craig Murray, of course, is the former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, who blew the whistle on CIA and MI6 torture in the country. He has done an extraordinary bit of sleuthing. The article is titled "Dystopia UK: Genocidal RAF Squadron Targeted by Palestine Action is Owned by a Hedge Fund." This is an absolutely extraordinary story. So Palestine Action, who there aren't enough compliments that I can heap upon them. They are a activist group who break into the factories of companies that make weapons used by Israel to genocide the Palestinians. They recently broke into an RAF base and painted RAF jets that are routinely flown to Israel with red paint, and this has led the British government to consider prescribing them as a terrorist group. What didn't get reported on by the media is that the RAF planes parked at this base, they're owned by a hedge fund. And they are owned by a hedge fund and loaned to the RAF through a chain of 7 cutout companies. I won't go into the full details of it. I just urge you to just read this. But it's like, effectively there's company after company after company is effectively like leasing RAF jets to the RAF itself. Now, at every stage in that these 7 different firms to get to the actual company that owns these fighter jets, at every stage, consultants and hedge fund managers are going to be skimming money out of it. at every single stage. So it's, you know, again, it goes back to the point. Well, okay, we're going to spend a lot more money on defense. What that means from a Western perspective is we're going to spend a lot more money lining the pockets of hedge fund managers and people in the city of London and Wall Street. It's not actually going to translate into anything like war fighting capability. You know, it is a hugely corrupt racket and grift. And meanwhile, China and Russia are innovating in every sphere of warfare with weapons that just work, and they have the resources and the capabilities to just keep building and producing. You know, I think there is something like kind of bleakly poetic about, yes, a 2-hour meeting where a bunch of probably highly remunerated people within the power structure basically just went on a holiday, met up for a couple of hours, had a laugh, signed off on some bullshit, back of a fag packet joint declaration, and then probably buggered off to the red light district.
Well, the other point I wanted to make was that what's revealed by Craig Murray here, again, who we're hoping to get on the show at some point, is that this isn't just true of like the armed forces, which are like, this is like the ridiculousness of late stage imperialism. They've even hollowed out their own military capacities to make sure that money gets drained out of them for the profits of several different shell corporations, basically. So like for what the ownership structure of like this RAF squadron, it is mirrored all the way across Britain and across the public sector, which is that the public sector, including the armed forces, now exists just to funnel money into hedge funds and banks, basically. That's what it exists to do. The British state is basically running like a giant series of Ponzi schemes, which is what the entire British state structure now looks like, with a very small section of the British population getting, to use Lenin's quote Lenin's phrase, clipping coupons as a result of this deeply corrupt, deeply parasitic economy that is basically running on fumes from the legacy of like the high imperial days. And this is the deeply corrupt, squalid mess that not just Britain, but the US is also in this position. In Britain, it's just more obvious. The French and the Germans and the Dutch won't be much better. But so are they saying that this is now something which is going to be capable of marching off and fighting the Russians? No. Or the Chinese? No. Or Iran? No. So all this ruling class is capable of doing is just printing money digitally and absorbing it again. That's it. And their only concern is to keep this scam going for a few more years. That's their only concern. And if the country goes to rack and ruin, if the country collapses, they don't care. That's the thing. They don't give a shit, because in their mind, they cannot picture a scenario in which they are not in charge. But the same was probably true of Louis XVI, or Tsar Nicholas II, and we all know what happened to them. Just to conclude, though, on the NATO summit, what was not discussed at the NATO summit, in fact, what was barely mentioned, was Ukraine, because, and again, I think we should probably dedicate a significant section of next week's show to this. Is that whilst the eyes of the world have been on Iran and West Asia, the Russians have just been carrying on pushing forward in Ukraine. And I think that we should pay more attention to the fact that Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum said, in essence, that what you and I have discussed before is correct, which is that they are going to take most of Ukraine. He didn't say this directly. He said wherever the Russian soldier puts his boot, that is Russia. So I think that there has been a debate in the Kremlin, and they've finally come to the conclusion that, well, Trump isn't capable of negotiating anything. The imperial bureaucracy isn't going to let him, even if he wanted to. So that to end the war, they will have to collapse the Kiev regime completely and take most of Ukraine, possibly whilst leaving the Western sort of Banderite heart to be an indigestible meal for the Poles to deal with. But Kit, I'll throw to you for final thoughts on the Ukraine question, but we will be returning to this, I think, next week.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do. I think that it is interesting how shunted off the news agenda Ukraine has been. Almost entirely. I have scoured the front pages of every major British newspaper. Britain, of course, being the one of the outriders who's still desperately clinging on to some fantasy of Ukraine, quote unquote, winning this, and they are intensely relaxed about sacrificing a lot of Ukrainians in the process, trying to do this because they think it will lead to Russia's collapse. We spoke, I believe it was the week before last, on a statement by Pete Hegseth, which it didn't get any media pickup whatsoever, where he explicitly stated US military support for Ukraine is over. Okay, he stated it very plainly. It generated zero headlines, and then a few weeks later, after we covered this on the show, there is a Ukrainian ultra called Owen Matthews who writes for the Spectator and the Telegraph, it seems, and he wrote a piece referencing the fact that Hegseth had said the plug had been pulled on Ukraine. Now, this was always the plan. This was always going to happen, and yes, as you state, the management of this has been passed over to Europe. So it's probably going, that's a few months more at most. That they're going to be able to equip and supply Ukraine, and for the most part, they'll be doing that by buying whatever's left from America's threadbare stockpiles to pointlessly throw at Russia. And yes, and I think that the Russian position now is, well, we tried negotiating. Each time it's been sabotaged. Zelensky shows absolutely zero interest in backing down or making any concessions or talking or facing up to the reality of things, both on the battlefield and geopolitically. So I think the time has now come for us to go for the jugular and really, yes, as you say, collapse the Maidan regime for good. And we are seeing huge Russian advances on a daily basis, with very little in the way of Ukrainian resistance, because they're running out of people. They've got virtually no ammunition, and they are technologically and they are technologically outmatched in every area by the Russians. So we will see. We are still in the early stages of the summer, and there has been a lot of talk about a major Russian offensive over the summer. We'll see where we are in September or October. We could be looking at a very different map of Ukraine by then.
Indeed, and I think that this is we will return to this next week, but I want to pivot now to another favorite tactic of British imperialism and US imperialism, which is, of course, the application of terrorism. Now, if you are of the same generation that myself and Kit belong to, which is the what I'm going to refer to as the doomed millennial generation, which is we grew up and sort of came of age. I think we both did, Kit, at the time of the beginning of the so-called war on terror. In fact, that was pretty much my political awakening. Was like 9/11 and its immediate aftermath, and the war in Iraq and everything else that spun out from it. Now, if you remember the stuff from 20 years ago, you'll remember constantly that that Al Qaeda was apparently everywhere, but also nowhere. The US and the British and the French were saying that they had to go to the Sahel countries, they had to go to Nigeria because Al Qaeda type groups were all over these countries, and therefore the French needed to have their military garrisons in their neo colonies like Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, and that the British needed to be engaged in West Africa, including in the former colony of Nigeria, because of Boko Haram. Now, what has occurred over the last 10 years, really, in works such as your colleague Max Blumenthal's book, Management of Savagery, your own reporting, and the work of others who are what I would call dissident journalists, what's come out is that the US and British role when it comes to Al Qaeda is exactly the opposite, of course, of what we were told. Not only is it the case that they were literally had bin Laden working for them as an asset in Afghanistan for over a decade, but also that he remained one for quite some time afterwards. You have talked about extensively the Al Qaeda role in both Bosnia and Kosovo, and the fact that they were again working very closely with the CIA and MI6. The Al Qaeda role in Syria has been chronicled by Max Blumenthal again in the work that he did on that country. The usage of Islamic fundamentalist reactionaries in Libya was a trick that was a favorite of the British. We've talked about before the Manchester bombing being carried out by a man whose family was in the Libyan Islamic fighting group, who were sent to Libya by the British and then brought back on a Royal Naval vessel. So the extent of the entanglement of the British state with the very thing they claimed to be fighting so enthusiastically for a decade has been, I think, by this stage, decisively proved. So it should be of no surprise then that that they are apparently in league with the people who they were so vigorously denouncing a decade ago. Everybody remember Bring Back Our Girls? Remember that piece of delicious hypocrisy? Well, here's a former Nigerian cabinet minister talking about the reality of who is behind Boko Haram.
I served on the Boko Haram committee. Now, 2 plus 2 at times has to be equal to 4. So even if I can't give you 4, but I can give you 2 plus 2, we will then have to come to the conclusion that I'm giving you 4. I served on that committee, and villagers kept telling us that in the middle of the night, helicopters piloted by white people kept landing and offloading guns, goods, and all kinds of and money to these people. Now, villagers they don't even know who these white people are, and they have no reason to lie to us. Now, we made a mistake. When I said some of us on the Boko Haram committee made a mistake, we thought it was the French that were doing this. Now we have an American congressman said, no, it was the Americans who were doing this. And when you then add that to the Obama administration refusing to sell weapons to us, to Nigeria, on the grounds that we had human rights violations in the way we were dealing with Boko Haram, not in the way we were dealing with ordinary Nigerians where there were no security issues.
Right, so just going back to our main screen here. Thanks to African Stream for putting together that video. Go check out their channel. I got a lot of interesting stuff on developments in the Sahel and elsewhere on there. So thanks to them. And also thanks to all 997 of you watching live. Let's push that up by 4 and get ourselves over 1,000 on the live stream, everybody. Excellent stuff all around there. So if you, for the benefit of those on the audio, that's a former Nigerian cabinet minister describing his work on the Boko Haram committee a decade ago. And the testimonies of villagers from the parts of Nigeria that are afflicted by Boko Haram incursions and actions, saying that they were being supplied via helicopter, piloted and brought in by white pilots and others, being supplied with weapons and money. Now, that's not just a bunch of Nigerian peasants making stuff up. That fits completely with everything we know about how the British and the Americans have operated in Syria, in Libya, and elsewhere. Kit, I throw to you for your analysis of what was said in that testimony there and the wider situation.
Well, I mean, I think that I attach an enormous amount of credibility to what Mr. Akinyemi said. It fits in so neatly with what we know to an absolute certainty happened in so many has happened in so many countries and continues to happen. I mean, so for instance, you mentioned Bosnia and the West's long-running bromance with Osama bin Laden. The Bosniak forces in the Bosnian civil war, they were supported by Mujahideen fighters who were bussed in by the CIA on black flights from all over the world. Osama bin Laden visited Bosnia, Sarajevo very frequently. He was even given a Bosnian passport by Alija Izetbegovic, who was the US puppet leading the Bosniaks. And so, I mean, what he's describing is exactly what happened in Bosnia, and it's exactly what happened in Kosovo, and it's exactly what happened in Libya and Syria, as you say. Now, a very interesting component of this was we it might be a few months back, we discussed how Somaliland, which is this wannabe state or kind of quasi-statelet, which formed part of, for a very long time, formed part of Somalia, is to all intents and purposes a British neo-colony. It's every wing of its government and state apparatus is directed and overseen by the British. That covers their security services, police, military, their government. After we reported on this at Decline and Fall, I had someone reach out to me anonymously via email, saying, asking if I was aware of any British meddling in Somalia itself. And funnily enough, I am, and I'm in possession of a number of leaked documents that show Britain is doing almost exactly the same thing it's doing in Somaliland in Somalia. Now, one of the projects that Britain runs in Somalia is an effort to, quote unquote, rehabilitate al-Shabaab fighters. Now, al-Shabaab is, of course, this very dangerous terrorist group that we've been told about how awful and evil and what a threat they pose. It is surely no coincidence that there are members of the Somalian government who are ex-al-Shabaab fighters. The obvious question arises: are they kind of alumni of Britain's rehabilitation programs? It's really quite extraordinary. What the Nigerian minister stated as well about how, well, we were not fighting average Nigerians, we were fighting Boko Haram. I mean, this applies to Kosovo, where we were told there was the Yugoslav authorities were fighting this genocidal war against the general population. They were fighting against an Al-Qaeda, MI6, CIA-tied terror group, the Kosovo Liberation Army. A very similar, if not identical, dynamic played out in Ethiopia, where you have the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is what ruled Ethiopia with an iron fist for decades, was used systematic rape of prisoners, carried out many massacres, and was deeply corrupt. They got shunted out of power. I think it was less than 10 years ago, and Ethiopia transitioned to democracy. The TPLF ever since has attempted to wage war on Ethiopian authorities ever since, and the Ethiopian government's crackdown on the Western-backed and probably funded and armed and directed TPLF was framed for a period as an attack on the general population, when it wasn't. So again, one has to wonder, well, how are TPLF fighters being bussed into Ethiopia? How are they getting weapons? How are they carrying out their attempted regime change war against the democratically elected government of Ethiopia? Well, probably it's arriving on helicopters, isn't it? Flown by white people.
Yes, and I want to just spell out to everybody like how this works, which is that the aim of like the British and the Americans, but this is a British speciality, is that this game that is being played has many levels to it. Now, when it comes to the backing of Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, TPLF, and others, including those active in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, the aim of this is to create a war without end, basically. There's enough poverty and deprivation in these places and enough desperate, angry men and boys to be paid a certain amount by a terrorist organization to become fighters for it. And then what you do is you take them along, brutalize them, psychologically break them, and remake them in the image that you want, and then turn them loose on, the civilian population quite a lot of the time. You keep them armed and supplied via the methods that Nigerian minister and Kit's just been talking about. And what you do is you create a situation where the government, which were a lot of these places, the governments had inherent weaknesses, where the government cannot guarantee the security of the citizenry. Therefore, the citizenry will turn against a government, particularly a government that is not acting in the interests of imperialism. And then the imperialists, be they British, American, or French, will step forward and say, but we can secure you if you allow us to have military bases in your country. And by the way, we'd like certain concessions around natural resources, markets, etc. And this is how, of course, the French justified their continued military presence in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso. It's how the British justified their continual involvement in Nigeria, defending, of course, the near monopoly they had for a long time over Nigerian oil. And you guarantee that the state can never properly develop by basically putting in place a permanent insurgency. Basically creating a permanently destabilized situation, meaning that the Nigerian state can never develop to the point where it can challenge the hold of the British over its economic development. That's how you secure states in permanent neo-colonial status. Notice that a few years back, the Mozambican government invited Portuguese army representatives back into the country to counter a quote-unquote Al-Qaeda insurgency in Mozambique. Now, I wonder where that Al-Qaeda insurgency might have come from and who was behind it. But you see where this leads and what it's meant to do. Now, this, of course, feeds back domestically into Britain itself, because now you can't open the page of any newspaper or listen to any TV radio show without some moron screaming about Islamism or something else. And that is then used to divide the domestic working class and keep everybody shouting and screaming at each other, and ignoring the fact that the primary employers of the most reactionary and disgusting types of Islamic fundamentalists are the British government. And they have been for a very long time. So this is the game. It has a foreign aspect, it has a domestic aspect, and the two reinforce each other mutually. And what's happening now is that thanks to the work of certain journalists and testimonies, including from that Nigerian former cabinet minister, we're starting to see how the game is played. And I'll just conclude on this point, which is that the Obama administration slapping an arms embargo on Nigeria when they started to go after Boko Haram, again, is typical. Because whenever the Americans or the British or the French start screaming about human rights, what it generally means is a government has gone after their proxies. That's it. Kit, did you have anything more you wanted to come in on this question?
Well, I mean, nothing specific, but I do just think that yes, it's just that like you summate this pretty much perfectly, which is that that there is a constant effort by Western powers to create tension, which they can use to justify their presence, their penetration of foreign governments, of foreign security services, of foreign intelligence services. It is a perpetual. How would you phrase it? It is a perpetual destabilization effort, which means that real change doesn't happen, can't happen, yes, the West is always waiting in the wings to help. And we don't just see this in Africa, we see this all over the world. We see it in Europe, where, I mean, again, on the subject of Bosnia, the British, there are opposition leaders in Bosnia who have openly stated that Sarajevo is crawling with MI6 spies who are stirring up trouble. And then in response to local tensions, the British then use this as a pretext for deploying yet more quote unquote peacekeepers to the region who walk around with their guns, just drawn, waiting for trouble. It creates a situation where you are perpetually a stray trigger pull away from all-out war. It cements and justifies and legitimizes what amounts to effective military occupations of great swaths of the world. But we are seeing in many parts of Africa, the French and the Americans and the British being turfed out. We are seeing positive, encouraging developments on that front in certain parts of Africa, and it bears repeating. Africans are not stupid; they can see very clearly what's being done here. And I mean, in the AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, which are led by military administrations which enjoy mass popular support, they are desperately trying to rid themselves of any and all Western influence, and it's catching on across the continent. And again, I think in a few years' time, the things are going to look very, very, very different. And it's notable that the mainstream media has now started going after the leaders of like Burkina Faso and Niger in a very big concerted way, and talking about how they are winning hearts and minds, despite the fact that they're these evil dictators. And it's like, well, I mean, they're not perceived as that by the local population at all. And they are offering very clear lessons in liberating. They're offering very clear lessons to nations in Africa in how to liberate themselves. Because failure to do so is just going to result in, yes, yet more of this perpetual tension machine.
Yes. Now, I think this is when we will return to this story, because I think that the liberation of the Sahel is going to be a very interesting and a very vital process to continue monitoring. I think that it's inappropriate at this stage to pivot to a story which is in the opposite direction, which is nations getting crushed. And the nation in question, of course, we are talking about today is Bulgaria. And I believe we have at least one Bulgarian watching today. And there is a recent development in Bulgaria, which is the government there has, without consultation with the citizenry, pushed through the plan to join the euro. Now, I think it's important to say at this stage that since the full restoration of capitalism in Bulgaria, Poland, and other places in the late/early 1990s, what has happened is a slow death in each of these countries, including in, of course, the republics that spun out of the former Yugoslavia. What has happened is, of course, mass exodus of anybody who can possibly work for slightly higher wages elsewhere, caused by the complete decimation of the pre-existing industrial base, a dramatic spiraling in the cost of living, and as a consequence of that, the collapse of the birth rate. So you have mass emigration out of these countries, destruction of the economic base. You have governments which don't represent anybody other than the US, the British, and the Germans, and you have the remaining population reduced to the status of being near indentured labor status of various German or American corporations who choose to set up shop. This is the fate of all of these Eastern European former people's democracies, and for whatever problems that the rule of Todor Nikolai Ceausescu or the late period Titoites had, what has come afterwards is literally the death of these nations overseen by these Brussels/London/Washington controlled comprador regimes, and the membership of the euro taken up by these like comprador wretches in Bulgaria has basically condemned Bulgaria to lose any sovereignty whatsoever and be controlled almost entirely by external forces. Kit, as a resident of a Balkan nation, how familiar is this rather wretched story to you?
Oh, very, very much so. And I think that, like, Bulgaria, the reason this story caught my eye, and it was published by The Conversation, which is a somewhat questionable outlet, which typically attracts essays from academics, which are then they're then licensed or syndicated for republication in other Western news outlets. But they do sometimes publish some gold. Now, this piece that you have up on screen is a very, very kind of vanishingly rare acknowledgement that EU membership for Bulgaria has been a complete and total disaster. But not only that there is significant local opposition to further European integration, and that EU membership has, outside of certain construction projects in the capital Sofia, has offered zero tangible benefits and a lot of negative downsides for the overwhelming majority of the population. It has precipitated mass brain drain as people flee for better salaries. It has precipitated a growing level of discontent and anger towards the EU. There are, the great swaths of Bulgaria which are now depopulated or, kind of completely barren because everyone's just left. The same story is true in the former Yugoslavia, and it is absolutely tragic. Populations are collapsing at an absolutely rapacious rate. Entire cities and towns are being reduced to basically ghost towns, because anyone who can leave is doing so. They suffer from very low local wages and high and rising living costs. I saw recently that a Croatian newspaper had reported on how the cost of goods in supermarkets in Croatia was 4 times that of Germany. And it's a similar story, throughout the Balkans and the former Yugoslavia, where you have, average wages of, a few hundred euros versus the cost of basic essentials being stratospherically higher than they are in Western Europe. It is a fundamentally unsustainable situation, and I think to a certain extent, at least in the post and pre Yugoslav context, if I may say so, that there is I'm sure it is deliberate, because by token of making conditions basically unlivable for average people, all of the political, ethnic and religious contests and squabbles that prevent Western corporations, raping and pillaging the region. Those problems kind of recede into the background, as we discussed during our Yugoslavia special. It was the US and Europe, particularly Germany and France and Britain, were hoping that once they broke up Yugoslavia, they would have basically a free pass to just completely raid the region's very vast natural resources. But there are all sorts of local issues which get in the way of that. Well, one way of resolving those problems is to make everyone leave and basically hollow out the population to the extent that you basically have a workforce who have no choice but to work for subsistence wages for Western corporations, and yes, meanwhile, anyone who has the money or the education or one way or another the ability to do so gets out of the way. And I think it's particularly interesting because we are relentlessly bombarded in the Bulgarian context. We are relentlessly bombarded with polls that tell us that support for EU membership has never been higher throughout Central and Eastern Europe. As someone who's traveled around the region extensively for 10 years, I don't think I've ever met someone who has a positive view of the EU whatsoever. And I'm talking, average people, which does tend to suggest that these polls are falsified, rigged, or explicitly only speak to wealthy liberals in capital cities who benefit slightly in one way or another from EU investment, or indeed the NGO industrial complex, which the EU is maintains alongside the US. There are many cities in Central and Eastern Europe where you see a lot of anti-EU graffiti, along with anti-NATO graffiti as well, I might add. But it's like, so yeah, this is I think Bulgaria joining the euro. I mean, why any country would possibly think this was a good idea after the treatment of Greece, which endures to this day. And I might add that Greece similarly suffers from exorbitantly high and rising living costs and stagnant low wages, which is again triggering a mass depopulation and brain drain. The only reason that the Bulgarian government is signing off on this is because it is comprised of pro-Western compradors who do not represent the wishes, interests, or views of their populations, but are willing to dance to the tune in return for a pat on the head and maybe a discreet under-the-table payment from the EU and US. And I also think as well that the fact that the fact that there is still a push to enrol countries in the euro could well be an indication that Brussels knows that the game is up in terms of expansion, and they are trying to retrench and embroil as many countries as they possibly can while they're still in business.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the potential for further positive development in the EU is basically zero. They was massively damaged by the Eurozone debt crisis over a decade ago. The southern European countries have never truly recovered from that. There is open discussion in places like Germany or particularly Germany, of the need to cut off the Southern Europeans at a certain point and the Eastern Europeans and refocus the EU just to basically comprise Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Maybe France, but Germans have conflicted opinions when it comes to France. So this didn't happen a decade ago. I think because the Germans still thought they could still get something out of it, and I think the Americans very much wanted the EU project to continue. The EU project now is completely fucked. They're not getting well. They were talking about getting Georgia. They're not getting that anymore. I don't think they're going to get Armenia either. I think Pashinyan is probably not long for this world, political world. So this is over. This is just a last desperate, squalid attempt to institutionalize the neo-colonial control of countries like Bulgaria, which has all of the sovereignty and independence and development that it got in the socialist period has been destroyed and wiped out. And let's be absolutely clear: capitalism is a dead and defunct system, and when it is attempted to be applied to developing nations or poorer nations, all it leads to is that nation being controlled by an imperialist power and rapaciously ransacked and destroyed, which is what has happened to all of these countries. Ukraine is the worst example because that's the one where Western control went the deepest and the furthest, and it was on the front line with the Russians. But the same is true in all of these places. The last 30 years, except for like a small minority of wealthy liberals, and by the way, ex-Communist Party officials who pocketed all the cash and then fucked off, for the ordinary working class person in all of these countries, it has been an absolute unmitigated disaster. But if you are Bulgarian or Croatian or Bosnian or Serb or any other nationalities of the former Eastern Bloc watching this, take heart from the fact that perfidious Albion isn't too far behind you, and vengeance will be yours in the end. Given that our final story today takes us to the shores of perfidious Albion and variously, shall we say, various conspiracies cooked up by the British government to keep its rebellious provinces under control. And we turn finally today to a series of stories related to Scotland, the land that I currently dwell in. And this is a story that came out of the UK Defence Journal about pro-independence, pro-Scottish independence accounts being run from Iran, which is an interesting scare story. And as with all of these scare stories that are run, whether it's Putin, I see the Sun today, the Murdoch paper has been saying that it's Putin that's sending all the immigrants to Britain. 10 years ago, it was Putin who was actually behind the entire Scottish independence movement. It's Putin who's behind, I don't know, the trains being late. What this story is another classic case of projection, accusing Iran of running, pro-Scottish independence Twitter accounts. In actual fact, what it's about is something deeper and involving British state shenanigans, which, Kit, you've worked on before. And can you explain what is really going on here for the audience? Which, by the way, audience now consists of 1,212 of you. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Keep on sharing. Keep subscribe to the YouTube channel, etc., etc. Yes, Kit, throw to you for our final story for today.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think this is really interesting. I mean, because it is a long-running lie that there is foreign meddling and involvement in the Scottish independence movement, and this is a lie which has been pushed by fifth columnists within the SNP, for instance. One Stuart MacDonald, who is now thankfully out of Parliament, although he's now a member of the, I believe it's the John Smith Trust, which was set up by a veteran MI6 person, which does tend to give you some clue about whose interests he was actually serving while supposedly fighting for Scottish independence. This article in the UK Defence Journal, at the very end, buried at the bottom, is an editor's note which states this article does not claim that Scottish independence is a foreign plot, nor does it suggest that support for independence is illegitimate, inauthentic, or driven by anything other than sincere political conviction. And this is after a lengthy article explicitly claiming that the entire of online pro-independence movement is being run by Iran. Right, so it's quite an astonishing editor's note after offering layer upon layer of conspiracy theorizing about how, well, some pro-independence accounts on Twitter have not been as active since the conflict against Iran began. And this is somehow proof of the fact that prominent independence accounts are run by Iranians. Like I say, this is a very well-worn, long-standing narrative, which is completely false. We heard, yes, that there was significant, for many years we heard there was significant penetration of the Scottish independence movement by Russia. Zero evidence to support this whatsoever. In May 2021, the Henry Jackson Society published a report claiming that Iran was peddling disinformation to influence the Scottish election. It offered zero evidence whatsoever apart from reporting by Press TV on current affairs related to Scotland. And it's a very, very effective means, or at least from the perspective of the brain trust in perfidious Albion, which might be a contradiction in terms, that it's a very good way of diminishing and delegitimizing the Scottish independence movement. I'm sure they'll start targeting Wales in due course. But funnily enough, the objectives of this campaign were spelled out very, very, very plainly in a declassified document that Britain runs something called the Counter Disinformation Unit, which has since been renamed the National Security Information Online Team. Perhaps because Whitehall apparatchiks thought this was slightly less threatening and disturbing as a name. But if you go to page 8, it references the Times front page splash on the Henry Jackson Society's claims of Iranian meddling in Scott's election. It lists the very obvious reasons that this is bullshit. It states that the Times report didn't align with the Counter Disinformation Unit's own monitoring. These claims were discussed with social media platforms directly, like Twitter and Facebook, who found no evidence. So that's a very clear thing. And it states this story prepared for possible unfair result type narratives post-election. So quite clearly, in advance, the foundations of the narrative that there had been election meddling were being laid in case the wrong result occurred. And this was, of course, I believe it was the first Holyrood, that's the Scottish Parliament election, where Alba, which is the late Alex Salmond's breakaway Scottish Independence Party, was running for office. The utility of this is very, very clear. But what's quite interesting is how the CDU stated this story gained little traction and had no major impact. Now, this was widely reported, including by the BBC, of course. But yeah, I think that people are so wise and also just tired of these bullshit narratives of Russian meddling at this point, or foreign meddling at this point, that they reflexively reject it. Like does anyone, apart from maybe like some tiny percentage of the population who are completely deranged, Russophobic, paranoid lunatics, believe that Putin is behind the boats reaching Dover? Like, I mean, I saw widespread mockery, like almost universal mockery of this on social media when it landed. Nobody's buying it anymore, and it's just yet another example of how utterly divorced from public perceptions mainstream media reporting is, but also in a kind of optimism-inducing way, the fact that they can't get away with this rubbish anymore. It was a very potent propaganda narrative of Russian meddling in everything, or Russia weaponizing dolphins and all this other rubbish. Like, a lot of people believe this, and we were told this for day in, day out for many years. It doesn't have the impact it once had. And I think that strongly suggests that, people now understand that they are being lied to on an industrial scale by the mainstream media. And that is why that may account for why so many people have joined us on this stream today. If so, colour me delighted and flattered.
Well, indeed. So 1,226 of you watching now. So thank you to all of you who are tuning in on YouTube and on Twitter. Good to have you all with us. Now, just to reach our final point here, you mentioned a gentleman by the name of Stuart McDonald, who is shall we say, aligned with certain dubious elements in the security state, claiming that a few years ago, disinformation was being weaponized to record levels. And this is a guy who we've mentioned before, is a man with several, shall we say, rather interesting associations, including with, I think, the Integrity Initiative and other disinformation actors within the British security state system. And his interesting career probably tells us an awful lot about the British security services bid to hollow out the Scottish independence movement. But if guys like this were able to make a career for themselves in the Scottish the party that nominally led the Scottish independence movement, then it tells you an awful lot about how that got undermined by the London government itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's and I think that we could do an entire program on Stuart McDonald, but I mean, he's out of Parliament now, but his job to neutralise the Scottish independence movement via the SNP was, complete, basically. He had caused, personally, both directly and indirectly, massive fissures and disagreements within the party. He had been pushing for all sorts of insane policies, like the reintroduction of national service in Scotland, except it would be called national resilience, so it's completely different, which was very unpopular with the SNP. He was very much at the forefront of pushing trans rights as a wedge issue within the wider movement. So that has caused the SNP itself a large number of problems. But if we look at polls, support for Scottish independence has never been higher. And I think that the ever diminishing impact of propaganda like this is a testament to how the English ruling class have, things are starting to spin out of control. I mentioned the Welsh nationalist movement. That's growing in strength and number regularly as well. And I think that we are, this is the death throes. I mean, Tony Benn had a great line, which was, the United Kingdom is the last true vestige of the British Empire, and its splintering into 3 separate countries will be the very end of the British Empire. And I don't think that he was entirely wrong, actually, and it would be a huge blow to Anglo-American imperialism if Wales and Scotland were to go independent. So may that blessed day come sooner rather than later.
Well, the United Kingdom, so-called, was put together in order to pursue world conquests, and when it can no longer pursue world conquests, it will probably, on the current trajectory, disintegrate. And I'll conclude my contribution for this week by saying the only future for these lands of ours that we dwell in is to go in the direction of socialism, is to overthrow the wretched and contemptible, corpulent, parasitic ruling class that sits in the city of London, and make ourselves a socialist federation of England, Scotland, and Wales, which is no longer an island which is facing, should we say, outwards towards conquest, but one which is interested in internal development. Now, that's not going to be an easy task, given that there is a significant section of the population here who still make their money off imperialism. But it's vital, because the only thing that the continued rule by the City of London and the parasitic ruling class is going to do is to drag what's left of this country down into the gutter, as they attempt to preserve themselves. What we've seen in the last couple of hours of this show, and thanks to all 1,250 of you watching, is that the people who run old perfidious Albion don't actually care about the population of this island. They don't even actually care about their former world conquering plans really anymore. What they care about is clinging on for another few years. That's the only vision that they've got. The entire state, as Craig Murray has revealed in his latest article, is dedicated towards just funneling money to the ruling class in various different ways, not doing anything positive, not developing the country in any progressive sense at all. And until we get rid of this wretched class of people, this is the way it's going to go. So I think that brings us neatly to the conclusion of our rather epic 2-hour show for today. Thanks to all of you who have joined in. Thanks to my comrade and friend Kit Clarenberg and co-presenter down in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Kit, I leave the final word for you today to address the masses.
Well, I mean, what else is there to be said? I think, yes, this has, as you say, been an epic episode. We really hope you've enjoyed it, and that you found value in it and maybe learned some new things. We will, we think it's important to bring you this information, and we have a blast doing it too. As I said at the start, please like, share, subscribe. If you're feeling extremely generous, do drop us a donation via Buy Me a Coffee or via a Substack subscription. But we'll settle for likes and shares and comments to beat the algorithms. But yes, thank you so much for tuning in such large numbers. We are humbled and flattered that you've taken an interest in this, and we will see you very soon. So take care. God bless.
Goodbye, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.
Take care. Bye-bye. Whew.
Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. این بانگ آزادی کز خاوران خیزد، فریاد انسان هاست کز نای جان خیزد، اعلام طوفان هاست کز هر کران خیزد، آتش فشان قهر ملت های در بندد، حبل المتین توده های آرزومندد. Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. Allahu Akbar, Khomeini Rahbar. دشمن بداند ما موج خروشانیم، زایده
بازو به بازو صف به صف ما آهنین چنگیم سنگر به سنگر جان به کف آماده جنگیم تخت شهنشاهان شد سرنگون از ما بخت تبهکاران شد واژگون از ما دامان آزادی شد لالگون از ما ما حافظ آزادی و اسلام و قرآنیم ما در پی آسایش و معراج انسانیم
الله اکبر خمینی رهبر الله اکبر خمینی رهبر
ما در ره اسلام پیمان خون بستیم زنجیر استعمار مردان بگسستیم از دام اهریمن با یاد حق رستیم ما نغمه الله اکبر بر زبان داریم ما چون خمینی رهبری روشن روان داریم
الله اکبر